of the family's rights to privacy, protection from arbitrary interference, and freedom of movement, but it is mainly a violation of the rights of the child. The rights of the child are protected in almost all humanitarian international law, and violations against children in non-combat situations are often overlooked, and this is a mistake, because the lasting impacts it can have on their development and their vulnerability makes them susceptible to any sort of political violation of their rights, not just direct violence. One issue that has also resulted because of the blockade's restrictions on travel is the right to health. Missed surgeries have been reported hundreds of times, and it's prevented people from caring for their sick or dying family members. Human Rights Watch reported an account of 2 Qatari parents who said that their children missed scheduled surgeries in Saudi Arabia, including one girl who needs specialist treatment or she will be paralyzed. Human Rights Watch also reported on a young girl having to miss a brain surgery due to the blockade. This is again children being impacted. More than anyone else, they cannot control where they travel and when. In addition, the most international pharmaceutical supply companies trading with Qatar before the blockade came from the UAE. A lot of life-saving medication, necessary medical instruments are not getting across the border still, despite some efforts to try and assuage this issue. And anti-venom for deadly regional snakes is among the top medications that is not making it across. The UAE therefore has a particular responsibility in this area, and an area that needs to be addressed by the international community. It is apparent that these issues not only constitute flagrant violations of human rights in some theoretical sense, but they have a practical application to real lives, human lives that stand to be lost or permanently damaged because of these political decisions. They exemplify exactly why we need these protections in the first place. They show us what happens when even the most basic rights are temporarily taken away. Employment has been another issue, and I know that migrant workers have come up as a rights violation going on in the UAE during this review. But this Qatar blockade has also really impacted the state of migrant workers. Many of them are forced to return back to Qatar or back to their own countries, losing their only job, their only source of economic support, and it's had a negative impact on their families. It's estimated that 2 million migrant workers reside in the UAE, they reside in Qatar, which is most of Qatar's population. So imagine that 2 million people have to return to a country where they do not have a job. Certainly it cannot be overlooked that the UAE has taken some measures to protect migrant workers, such as ending the sponsorship program that linked work visas to their employer and did not give them the choice of resigning, changing employees, and coming and going from the country. However, the claim that at this review that was made that they are champions of rights for migrant workers is an affront to those who are losing those rights right now, and those who are losing everything because of these policies. The review is here to address continuing issues as they are. The current practices, especially with regard to the blockade, are unacceptable. Mechanisms for enforcement must be functioning for these changes to be meaningful in any real sense. The international community cannot be satisfied simply because some measures were taken towards improvement. When people continue to lose their businesses, their rightful properties, and all sources of income for their families. Property rights is another main issue here for migrant workers and also for those who own businesses or companies in another state which they're now being asked to vacate. Those who are employed elsewhere may have to give up their property, their resources, their source of revenue, and ultimately possibly their entire business. This is something that people have sunk their lives into and all of their finances, and to have it all taken away all at once is an affront to their rights. Next, I want to talk about freedom of speech, which my colleague will be presenting more on later. But just to tie it into how freedom of speech is impacted by this blockade, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and the UAE at the beginning of the blockade demanded Al Jazeera be closed down until negotiations could start again. And they were holding this over Qatar and continue to even after they have reduced their more extreme demands. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights Technical Mission reported high levels of instrumentalization of media, spreading campaigns of hatred and defamation, both in media and social media, including one paid campaign by the UAE made purposefully to link Qatar to terrorism. A number of rights groups have said that this constitutes not only hate speech but incitement of violence in some situations, and it certainly is making the situation for Qatari people all around the world much more tenuous. It has also been criminalized to express any form of sympathy with Qatar or Qatari people. This means on private or personal social media accounts. This means any form of dissent or critique. And the punishments for this are often inflicted upon the citizens of the blockading countries. For instance, if one of the blockading countries finds out that somebody is, in their mind, supporting or sympathizing with Qatar, they can have their passport or even citizenship stripped from them. In terms of the UAE, these measures have an additional violation to their international, their national constitution and criminal code. Freedom of religion has also been an issue in this case, not so much because of freedom of expression of religion, but because Qatari people who would normally make a pilgrimage to sacred and holy sites are unable to do so. They've been arbitrarily restricted from practicing their religion as they have the right to do. And this is also against not only most international law pertaining to freedom of religion, but the Arab Council for Human Rights has specific regulations regarding this issue. So, in conclusion, I just want to really point out that the international human rights community is in consensus. And despite that, we're not really seeing the critique that you would expect from the international political community. The measures that have been implemented in this blockade are a clear violation of international law. They have been identified as such by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And they are both violations of standards as well as actually legally binding documents and councils and agreements that these states have agreed to abide by. On these violations, we see human rights organizations around the world expressing the same concerns. The main point that these violations keep bringing up, however, is that in international conflict of any form, the civilians must not be targeted. This is protected in numerous international agreements and as well as in the basic standards for behavior in the international community. Targeting citizens is unacceptable, regardless of the political motivations of the state. This is a key point in many, many human rights violation cases. What we have seen at this and many other universal periodic reviews is the inability or unwillingness to assess a given state's behavior towards civilian populations on all sides and not in terms of the political context. Context is, of course, important in many, many, many ways. But when it comes to human rights, they must necessarily be separated from political concerns. Regardless of national stances on these conflicts, on the conflicts regarding these nations, the rights of citizens must be considered equally and neutrally, because human rights do not make judgments, and human rights do not take sides. They protect all human lives and capabilities. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, for your intervention, and thank you for reiterating the universal value of human rights, of course. And after having shed some light on this human rights situation and violations committed against citizens, as you said, which probably can amount to a collective form of punishment, I suggest to stay again on the UAE and to look into another form of targeting against civilians, against citizens, and it's mainly the issue of the arrest of prisoners of conscience in the UAE and violations to freedom of expression, which will be raised by Julia Legner from Al Karama, regional legal officer. So you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Today I would like to address the human rights situation in the UAE in view of the most recent review here at the Palais des Nations on Monday, 22nd of January. So during this third periodic review, 101 states have made recommendations to the UAE to improve their human rights record. I don't want to go too much into detail on this right now, but rather, first of all, offer a broader overview of the human rights situation in the UAE before going more into details on the recommendations made and the implications of this review. So the human rights situation in the UAE has significantly deteriorated since the last UPR in 2013, and really more broadly since the beginning of the Arab uprisings in 2011. And even though the UAE was not a country that was directly implicated and that didn't witness wider demonstrations, we've still seen a larger trend in the region of cracking down on fundamental rights, mainly freedom of expression and peaceful assembly. And therefore I would like to focus on three main points. It's first of all the legal arsenal that is very restrictive and that is used to prosecute peaceful dissidents. Secondly, the persistent practice of torture in the United Arab Emirates and the lack of accountability and the impunity for the perpetrators. And thirdly, the lack of cooperation of the United Arab Emirates with the UN human rights mechanisms. So to speak of the legal arsenal that we see, since the last UPR, the rights of freedom of expression have been further restricted and are systematically violated. We've seen the arrest of numerous peaceful activists, journalists, human rights defenders, but really anyone critical to the government. The laws that are mainly used to crack down on these individuals are three laws. It's the cybercrime law that was passed 2012, the law on combating terrorism offenses of 2014, and the recent amendments to the penal code in 2016. The cybercrime law, which was already criticized during the last UPR and which many states asked for it to be repealed or amended, continued throughout the last years to prosecute individuals. It basically criminalizes defamation and hands out harsh prison sentences to up to life imprisonment for anyone who publishes information aiming or calling to overthrow or change the ruling system of the state. The law also criminalizes insulting the ruler, damaging national unity or state reputation, and organizing without permissions. The law on combating terrorism, or the anti-terrorism law, defines terrorism in very broad and vague terms and allows for the criminalization of non-violent acts of criticism. So this law has also been used to systematically silence both Emirati and foreign peaceful dissidents and human rights advocates. The Penal Code amendments of 2016 entails provisions that also severely curb freedom of expression and punishes with up to 25 years in prison anyone who insults the leader of the UAE or even harms the reputation or symbols or institution of the state. Secondly, I would like to speak about the practice of torture. So since the last UPR, and despite the fact that the UAE has ratified the Convention Against Torture in 2012, we have documented several cases of people being tortured in the UAE. Moreover, despite the ratification of that treaty Since this day, the UAE has failed to submit its initial state report to the Committee Against Torture, which is overdue since the 19th of August 2013, which is a clear violation of its reporting obligations, and which also shows that there is no real commitment to eradicate the practice of torture. So in the UAE, it's usually the state security officials that use torture in two different ways. Either to coerce self-incriminating statements during interrogation, or as a form of punishment in prisons and other detention facilities. Amongst the acts reported by cases also documented by Al-Karama are beatings with plastic tubes, electrocution, exposure to extreme temperatures, sleep deprivation, waterboarding, being forced into stressful positions, continuous hooding and handcuffing, solitary confinement, rape, threats of rape, threats to families, and the list goes on. Following unfair trials, confessions extracted under torture are very much and very often used as sole evidence in trials to convict individuals to long prison terms. Moreover, there's also a climate of impunity, as there are no serious investigations into allegations of torture. So this was also confirmed by another UN independent expert, the former special reporter on the independence of judges and lawyers, Mrs. Gabriele Knaul, because she visited the United Arab Emirates in 2014. And she also reported that more than 200 complaints of torture and ill treatment had been presented before the judges and prosecutors, but were not investigated or accounted for in judicial proceedings. And just as a side note, I mean, we at Al-Karama, we have documented dozens of cases of torture since 2013, since the last UPR review. And we've also helped individuals that were released after being arbitrarily detained on the basis of the confessions extracted under torture to raise their voices internationally and on the UN level. If you follow, there have been several other events where these survivors of torture had the chance to speak about their experiences. And as I said, it's quite a scary phenomenon, and it oversteps something that we see in other countries where at least authorities they will not go as far as to torture foreign nationals, let alone nationals of Western countries. But in the UAE we see this, and that is not to say that the torture of anyone is worse than the torture of anyone else, but it is quite surprising to see that they don't even shy away from torturing other nationals other than their own, where they can be held accountable by other governments and prosecuted by other governments, because these individuals have the chance to also sort of seek legal remedy in the countries of their origin. Because as we've seen, the judiciary in the UAE is not independent, so the possibilities of seeking remedy in the UAE and seeking justice are limited, and therefore there's possibilities for these victims of torture also to pursue legal channels and in other countries through measures of a universal jurisdiction, which is also available for, like, for example, here in Switzerland, you could file a complaint against the people that have tortured you, and that complaint works in a way that the Swiss public prosecutor can issue an arrest warrant the minute the perpetrator of torture, or even someone higher up in the chain of command, enters the country. This person can be arrested for the acts committed in the country of origin, so in the United Arab Emirates, and that legal channel is also available for Emirati citizens. So that's just as a side note, and I would also like to congratulate a group of former torture victims that have formed last Friday officially during a press conference an association of torture victims called the Association for Victims of Torture in the UAE. Al-Karama would like to also express their support for this association and make you all aware of it in case there are other cases of torture to be reported to this association. To now move on to my third point, which is the lack of cooperation of the UAE with the UN human rights mechanisms. So, for example, we engage a lot with the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, which is able to render opinions or decisions on the legal character, the arbitrary character of someone's detention. And since the last UPR, that working group of the UN has issued 10 opinions on the arbitrary nature of the detention of individuals that were mostly sentenced after either an unfair trial or for the mere fact of making use to their fundamental rights to freedom of expression. And we regret to see that since then none of these, or hardly any of these opinions by the working group have been enforced and have been implemented. So there's a disregard of the UAE government to cooperate with the working group on arbitrary detention and to respect their decisions. Additionally, we also would like to recall that the UAE have been featured in all the 5 most recent reprisal reports by the UN Secretary General. And the most recent case illustrating that systematic practice of reprisals against human rights advocacy is that of renowned activist and 2015 Martin Annals laureate Ahmed Mansour, who we in the UAE understand to have been one of the last standing human rights defenders who was able to operate from within the United Arab Emirates, and was a very important channel of information for international human rights organizations. And with his arrest in March 2017, civil society has been silenced, and it is really difficult for international human rights organizations to even get to the information on the ground. People are afraid. There's the phenomenon of surveillance. There's reprisals not just against the human rights advocates themselves, but also against their families, practices of travel bans, practices of denying access to education, to medical care, and so on. Moreover, the UAE also failed to really cooperate with the special procedures. There are 8 pending invitation by special procedures mandate holders, some dating as far back as 2005, to visit the United Arab Emirates. So part of the mandate of the special procedures is also to be able to visit countries and make an assessment on the ground. And there's very important mandate holders, such as the Special Reporter on Human Rights Defenders, the Special Reporter on Torture, or the one on counterterrorism, that would be very relevant to have access to the country to assess the situation on the ground. And we would like to call on the UAE to really increase their cooperation, not just with the special procedures, but with all the UN human rights mechanisms. And even though I don't want to take too much time now, I would actually like to speak a little bit about the review of Monday and give a little bit of a resume. So I mean, we've seen 101 recommendations. Countries raised several recommendations on different issues. We've seen recommendations on the death penalty, women's rights, migrants' rights, a lot of recommendations on the establishment of a national human rights institution, or the ratification of international human rights instruments. We do, however, or we have not seen that many recommendations on the practice of arbitrary detention, the absence of legal safeguards, clear condemnation of the practice of torture, of the phenomenon of impunity for the perpetrators of torture. So just to pick some of the recommendations that we were actually happy to see being raised, for example, Italy, that recommended to consider the moratorium on the death penalty, to prohibit the practice of secret detention, guarantee freedom from torture and ill treatment, create an atmosphere in which civil society and human rights defenders can freely operate. There are many others. For example, surprisingly, the Czech Republic had very strong recommendations towards the UAE to eliminate the practice of arbitrary detention, incommunicado detention and torture, to ensure that fair trials are respected in the country. Or Austria, that was the only country, in fact, that mentioned famous human rights defender Ahmed Mansour, to release prisoners of conscience and to promote legislation that respects freedom of expression. So all in all, there were recommendations that we believe were very relevant. I mean, all of them are relevant, but some, I believe, are more critical than others. And I hope that in that light, the UAE will also decide to accept as many recommendations as possible and genuinely work on the implementation of these recommendations. We would have liked to see a few more recommendations really on the impunity for violations of torture and other severe human rights violations. No one addressed the issue of all the decisions made by the working group on arbitrary detention, as far as I recall, which is a pressing issue. There are up to 200 prisoners of conscience in both Emirati and non-Emirati in jail at the moment, and high UN bodies have qualified some of their detention as arbitrary and have called for their immediate release, and also to afford them the right of compensation. And I think it's very important that also in a context like the UPR, this is being recalled and some additional pressure is put on the UAE authorities to implement these decisions. To say a few final words on the state party during the review, not just to mention the UN member states and the recommendations they rendered, but I'm just taking this from the tweets that I've put out during the review. So the foreign minister of the UAE, Mr. Anwar Gargash, promised to establish a national human rights institution. My comment to that is, well, this was already promised during the last UPR session, so time to live up to that promise. He's also said that he was deeply concerned about polarization in the region, which for me is a bit perplexing, because what does that say about the Gulf crisis, and how come the UAE still criminalizes individuals for expressing sympathy with Qataris or expressing support for Qatar with up to 3 years in prison. He also said that the society was built on tolerance and that it had a positive human rights record. Well, I mean, we beg to differ. The serious human rights violations and individual cases of torture, arbitrary detention and forced disappearance that we've documented over the years speak otherwise. He also denied the fact that people are detained arbitrarily. Well, it's not just civil society that begs to differ, but also the UN independent experts of the working group. He also said, as a final word, he thanked the participants of the review and said that the UAE really appreciate this review process and will see recommendations as a guiding light. Well, I just hope that these words will follow the appropriate actions, and I can also affirm that Al-Karama will continue monitoring the implementation of the accepted recommendations and closely monitor the human rights situation on the ground, whether or not most of the human rights defenders are now behind bars. We will have ways to further monitor the situation and hope that we will see genuine improvement of the human rights situation in the UAE. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you also for calling our attention on the fact that the UN can achieve results, but only if we really follow up on the implementation of recommendations and on the follow-up. Now I think that it's time to move to the human rights situation in Israel. Just in a few seconds, maybe we can switch to your, yeah, sure, perfect. So I will now leave the floor to Ghada Al-Rayyan, a field researcher at Euromed, who is going to talk about the 12-year-long blockade of the Gaza Strip and its humanitarian consequences. So, Ghada, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. First of all, Israel has a long history of isolating the Gaza Strip with many closures since the 1990s. However, the blockade imposed in 2006 is an unprecedented form of collective punishment in its severity and length. In September 2007, Israel declared Gaza as a hostile entity and ruled that additional sanctions will be placed on Hamas regime in order to restrict the passage of various goods to Gaza Strip and reduce the supply of fuel and electricity. Restrictions will also be placed on the movement of people to and from Gaza Strip, but under international law, under international humanitarian law, Israel remains an occupying power despite its removal of 8,000 settlers from the Gaza Strip in 2005. Israel continues to control entry and exit into Gaza from its territory, as well as the Strip's airspace, sea, and many other aspects of its daily life and infrastructure, making it nearly impossible for residents to support themselves and build a productive future. The blockade prevented many patients from receiving appropriate treatment abroad and prevented hundreds of students from traveling to universities, educational programs, or even cultural programs abroad. Israel thus is violating the absolute prohibition on collective punishment in international humanitarian law, penalizing the entire population of Gaza for the acts of a few. In addition, since 2008, Israel has launched 3 military offensives against the Gaza Strip, devastating its already fragile infrastructure and exacerbating the humanitarian crisis created by a strangling blockade imposed for 12 years. So let us move to the humanitarian consequences in Gaza Strip since the Israeli blockade in 2006 and until now. First of all, I will speak about the deterioration of the humanitarian situation and of basic services, and then I will move to the economic collapse. So, by speaking about deterioration of the humanitarian situation and of basic services in Gaza, I will speak firstly about the fuel entry and electricity crisis. So for the past decade, the Gaza Strip has suffered from a chronic electricity defect which undermined already fragile living conditions. In May 2015, Egypt announced its success in destroying about 80% of the Strip's tunnels, which led to complete suspension of the entry of fuel through the tunnels. As a result, Palestinians have been suffering from severe restrictions on the entry fall and the consequent soaring of its price, and the only power plant in Gaza has operated at only 36% of its capacity. Frequently, it was forced to stop working completely during the past few years because of running out of fuel, and Palestinians in Gaza had to survive repetitive long periods of blackout. The situation has further deteriorated since April 2017 in the context of disputes between the de facto authorities in Gaza and the West Bank-based Palestinian Authority. So according to OCHA, 20 hours to 6 hours per day only after the decision of the Palestinian Authority to reduce payments for electricity supplied by Israel to the Gaza Strip, the real reasons behind the power crisis in Gaza Strip are the acute shortage of electricity, the rapid growth of demand on power, and the accumulation of debts to the company. The debts reached around $1.02 billion in 2012, So people cannot pay this great amount because of the deterioration financial situation resulted from the blockade and the severely low incomes of most of the families. The already high cost of electricity is made even higher by due tax, for example the blue tax, which imposed by the Palestinian government in the West Bank, and which amount to around 8.8 million US dollar a month. And let us move to the water situation in Gaza Strip. So consequences of power blockade add to the severity of water problems in Gaza Strip, with water services heavily dependent on 24 availability of electricity. 30% of the population today doesn't have ready access to water, while 80% has to buy drinking water for daily use instead of unavailable tap water. The most recent offensive in 2014 led to the exacerbation of water pollution and water shortage in the Strip, where about 1.3 million Palestinians have difficult access to water and the sanitation services, especially as 80% of water wells are not valid for use. In addition, the critical water shortage is expected to grow beyond reliability if the status quo is not improved by 2020. And according to the Palestinian Water Authority, about 95% of the water in Gaza doesn't meet the World Health Organization standards for potable water use. So the blockade, as well as the little, if allowed by Israel, intervention of international aid programs contributes to the aggravation of water problems in Gaza Strip. By speaking about healthcare in Gaza, so Gaza's vulnerable health system has been deeply affected by Israel's restrictions imposed both on access to essential medical supplies and on patients' movement into and out of the Gaza Strip. The public health system in Gaza has been greatly affected by the Israeli blockade and worse by the division between the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Severe shortage of essential drugs and medical equipment, constant instability of power supply, critical lack of fuel for generators, and inadequate munitions capacity have advanced the deterioration in the quality of healthcare services. Approximately 40% of necessary drugs became completely unavailable in Gaza Strip. In 2014, Operation Protective Edge left disastrous effects on the social and psychological situation of children, where nearly 551 children were killed and over than 3,000 others injured. Moreover, 1 out of 4 children needs psychosocial support because of the trauma and losses experienced during violence, including physical injury, fear of bombing sounds, and death of family members or friends. A spokeswoman for the Ministry of Health in Gaza, Ashraf Kadra, said that around 23 citizens, most of them children, had been victims to prevent medical referrals to patients in Gaza Strip. So, to speak about the economic collapse, and this is my second point in the presentation. So, while Israel is restricting Gaza economy, its 3 attacks within less than a decade caused a complete economic paralysis by devastating the infrastructure already fragile before these attacks. So all commercial crossings into and out of the Strip are completely closed, except from Kerem Salem crossing, whose closure rate exceeded 36% of the days during 2016. The rate of unemployment reached 43.6% in the third quarter of 2017, and the rate of poverty grows to 65%, and that of object poverty to 21%. Due to Israel's restrictions, most of the companies are unable or unwilling to invest in capital goods subject to devastation at any time, and this led to a significant decline in the work productivity of Gaza Strip, especially as compared to that of West Bank. Fishing and agriculture are two other sectors of industry significantly affected by the blockade. Fishermen can only sail 3 to 6 nautical miles in the Mediterranean and will be subject to arrest or shooting if they sail further. Should this blockade continue to restrict the economic lives of Palestinians in Gaza Strip, they will remain economically paralyzed and at a larger scale as time goes. Economic recession, food insecurity, unemployment, poverty depends on international aid, and diminishing faith in economic investment will continue to dominate the reality in Gaza. So, as a conclusion, I will just speak about what we demand from the European community or from the UN. So, or from the UPR, what shall that does? So the Euro-Mediterranean Human Rights Monitor, therefore, urgently demands the international community to help alleviate immediately at the blockade on Gaza Strip. First, we demand the Israeli government to end the illegal blockade in Gaza. Second, we call on the Israeli government to end the targeting of citizens and practice in violation of the 1949 Geneva Convention. Third, we call on the international community to hold Israel accountable for its continuous human rights violations, and to 31, economically sanction Israel until it respects Palestinians' human rights. So the international community should be able to separate between the collective punishment of the Palestinians by Israel and the political conflict between Palestine and Israel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rada, for this informative speech. And it's true that we all know about the blockade of Gaza, but it's hard to understand what it means and what's the real impact on the people there. So thank you again. And I will now give the floor to Iman Zoeter, a researcher again at Euromed, who is going to talk again about Palestine, but on another side, on the occupied Palestinian territories and the Israel policies of apartheid and settlement. So Iman, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. So, since the very beginning of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict in 1948 and throughout 1967, when the rest of the Palestinian territories have been occupied, apartheid has appeared to be a systematic practice against Palestinians, either who live in East Jerusalem, West Bank, the Gaza Strip, or even who are Israeli, who hold Israeli citizenship. Palestinians who reside in the occupied Palestinian territories are especially suffering from this racism on a daily basis. This includes different laws applied like depending on the race, discrimination in provided services, and in favor of the more than 640,000 Israeli citizens who are residing in some 169 settlements across the West Bank and East Jerusalem. So, in the next few minutes, I will concentrate mainly on 3 issues. I will cover the dual legal system, the residency issue of Palestinians who live in East Jerusalem, and finally, the problem of family reunification for Palestinians who live in different parts of the same occupied territories. So to start with the dual legal system, so in the occupied Palestinian territories, we basically have 2 laws that are functioning. We have the civilian law that is functioning for the settlers and who are living there, and there is the military law which governs the 4.7 million Palestinians in Gaza and West Bank. This military law is mainly consists of IDF orders, which appear to be problematic in several ways. First of all, these orders are usually not publicly displayed for Palestinians before starting to implement them. So you first get imprisoned for doing something that you are not informed about, and then you're informed of the military order that on which your charge has been based. Secondly, living under military orders means to be suppressed and prevented from practicing the normal rights which are ensured for Israeli settlers in the same territory. Even worse, the performance of these rights is criminalized, and Palestinians could face long years of imprisonment for this. This includes rights such as freedom of expression, belonging to political parties, joining peaceful protests, and many others. Living under military law also means discrimination even in the prisons. Unlike Israeli prisoners, Palestinians are labeled as security prisoners for committing completely the same crime. Being labeled as this means a lot. It means that the Israeli authorities have the right to deprive the prisoner from so many rights as simple as a telephone call. Moreover, the security prisoner is also deprived from the privilege of the early release system, which is provided for Israeli prisoners for the same crime. Even children are treated as security prisoners and can get up to 10 years of imprisonment for a simple act as throwing a stone. To make it clearer, if we assume that a person with Israeli nationality and has committed a murder, he will get far superior advantages, including the possibility of early release, than a Palestinian who is imprisoned on charges of incitement to resist the occupation. This is because the classification of the Palestinian that will be on the basis of security prisoner. In practice, this classification is inclusive for Palestinians. The other thing that I will move to, the second issue, is the residency issues in East Jerusalem. Like in East Jerusalem, there is another legal system that's functioning, which is the residency system. And we could say that it's even in some ways worse than the military one. It means that the Palestinians who was born along with all their families and ancestors in the land of East Jerusalem cannot hold the nationality. They only have a permanent residency. That could be easily revoked for leaving Jerusalem, for getting, for example, healthcare, for visit somebody outside East Jerusalem, or to study. Or simply because they cannot prove that their center of life is Jerusalem. To prove this, a lot of documents are required. Most of them Palestinians don't have. Based on this, more than 14,000 Palestinians who were residing in East Jerusalem has their residency permits revoked. So basically, it's a nightmare for every Palestinian residing in that place. Moreover, having only a permanent residency prevented parents from transferring their IDs to their children. So children are treated separately, and they have to apply for an ID, which might take years before being granted. More than 10,000 children in East Jerusalem are without an ID. This exposed them to harassment on checkpoints. They cannot properly benefit from the different life aspects such as healthcare, insurances, education, or freedom of movement. This is not only a discriminatory practice, but a clear violation of Israel's obligation under the International Convention on the Rights of the Child, that all children in its territories or under its authority should have the same rights. Paradoxically, while discriminating against Palestinians, Israel is financially supporting hundreds of thousands of new settlers to come and live both in East Jerusalem and West Bank. For example, they provide them with a free education, healthcare, proper housing, and generous tax relief. Unlike Palestinians who have to pay a lot of taxes but still have poor or even no services in return. So, moving to my third aspect is the family reunification issue, if I can really call it like this, because it's not like it appears unbelievable, but the Palestinian family members who are living in the same occupied Palestinian territories, like either in Gaza or West Bank, cannot move between these territories and to live together. So spouses and children can be separated easily by this separation policy. There are thousands of couples who get separated by this. while Israel found that there is nothing wrong with this policy, it's continuing easily to allow the reunification of Jewish Israeli citizens with their spouses, no matter in what part of the world they are. Moreover, they provide them with all the needed privileges in order to come and settle in the country. So while Palestinians cannot stay, their homes are demolished, they are kicked out of the country, other settlers from every part of the world, because they are Jewish, they can easily come and settle with a lot of privileges. So coming back to the family reunification, to clarify this issue further, it can be said that love between West Bank and Gaza is forbidden, or at least faces many legal obstacles that almost make it impossible. For example, if a young man from the West Bank married a girl from the Gaza Strip, and that the girl wanted to move to the West Bank, she needs a full reunification procedures that could extend to 4 or 5 years. So, just let me remind you that we are talking about the same geographical area. We are not moving between countries. And even worse, these measures may not succeed in the end. So it's years and years of separation. And this causes a lot of divorces based on this issue. The freeze on processing family reunification request has created a harsh reality for tens of thousands of Palestinian families. So spouses are unable to live under the same roof with their children, and their children are forced to grow up with a single-parent family, even if their parents want to live together. People cannot leave the occupied Palestinian territories to go abroad for medical treatment because Israel will not issue them a new visitor's permit. There is tens of thousands of women in the occupied Palestinian territories who have no legal status because of moving from one territory to another and remaining there. So they face constant threat of deportation. They became prisoners, basically in their homes, and are unable to live a normal life. So the situation cannot be named by any other name more than clear apartheid and complete discrimination against Palestinians. So there are a lot of evidences that confirms that Israel is systematically applying apartheid system to keep the Palestinian people suffer on a daily basis. It's not only these examples that I mentioned. There is many others that, and we had a lot of recommendations provided for Israel during its review, which occurred yesterday on this building, that's asking for this apartheid system to be revoked, and ensuring that it's clearly prohibited by international law and the international customary law. So, yeah, but unfortunately, we have also it's coming over and over again. These reviews, countries are really calling on Israel to stop this system of apartheid. During it happened the session that happened yesterday and on the two previous ones, they all calling on stopping this, but seems that Israel simply is not listening to this, and the suffer continues over and over. So let's hope that something different will happen during this review, and they will actually take this into consideration. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Iman. And yeah, it's true that even yesterday, if I'm not wrong, at least South Africa mentioned apartheid directly, regarding the Israeli policies. So I think that there is growing recognition, at least, of the phenomenon, and hopefully it will bring also some results.
Yeah. Yes, sure.
So I will thank you to all our panelists. I would like now to open the floor for any general questions or questions directed to any single speaker. So the floor is yours if you have any questions. Thank you.
I would like to ask something to Sarah. Sarah, you mentioned a 2 million figure of workers, the number of workers in Qatar. I just wanted a clarification from you, because not all these workers have to return home. I mean, and they are not all from other Gulf countries. I'm not sure if it was framed.
Well, not all of them. Oh, certainly not all of them were from other Gulf countries, but this is the number represented by Reuters for the number of migrant workers in Qatar. I think another estimate compared that to the population of Qatar, and it's almost 90% of the population. But of course, not everyone is from the Gulf states. I think that it's good to clarify that figure, but the point is more that so many are coming from these Gulf states, so not all of them.
Do you have any figure when it comes to the number of workers from other Gulf countries that have been working in Qatar that were obliged to return to their countries of origin?
Yes, I can provide that to you. I'm sorry, I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but I believe it was a number close to 2,000 or 3,000 of workers from Qatar and other states, and about 11,000 for workers from other states in reverse. But before I commit to that, I want to pull them up for you.
Okay, yeah, that's great. And you mentioned also the international community is not taking sufficient action in reaction to the blockade. What would you expect the international community to do? And also, which is the legal, let's say, the legal framework, the legal point of reference for Qatar to take any actions against the blockade? And as well, if they have been taking any actions, if you can elaborate or summarize what they have been doing so far.
Yeah, certainly. The problem with the issue, legally speaking, is that the UAE and I think also Saudi Arabia and Bahrain are not party to the Rome Statute, which would make them responsible to abide by the rules of international law, or else be tried in the International Criminal Court. But because they're not party to this, there's not really there's not really that mechanism there. Of course, that there are mechanisms, and this would, by the way, try individuals for human rights abuses. They're also not party. I know the UAE is not party to the ICJ, which would be able to try states for abuses. ICJ, the International Criminal Court of Justice. I apologize. Yeah, so that's a big problem, legally speaking. The international community is really their responsibility right now, at the very minimum, to push not just for the measures that are related to this topic that they've been pushing for a number of years, but to really hone in on them with specific reference to this crisis. I think that Qatar has not been able to take any international criminal court or International Court of Justice measures, but I know that they have been trying to strengthen their allies in the region. I know that they've been meeting as recently as Monday with Kuwait to discuss what they're planning to do as far as their bilateral relationship. So there's a lack of accountability legally here, which is why I think it is extra important that the international community do what they can, especially to make the criticism about the human rights abuses and not about political issues, separate themselves from the political issues so they're not following their state policy line on the other states.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions for Julia as well. Sorry, I'm confusing the notes now.
Sure.
Give me a second. You mentioned the amendment in 2016 of the Penal Code, talking about new provisions. How did these provisions change if compared to the previous version of the Penal Code? I mean, can you elaborate a bit on that?
There are several changes that impact different areas of rights. What I've mentioned mainly goes into the direction of freedom of expression, which is more strictly criminalized, or for which we see harsher punishments. It's not that defamation as such was not already criminalized beforehand, but to hand out sentences of up to 25 years for insulting or mocking state institution, even the state flag or symbol, is new and is definitely a deterioration from the old version. There's also other provisions that speak about the death penalty, so that it's made easier to hand out a death penalty, also based on voicing criticism and things that pertain to national security. I think we've done at the time a legal analysis of the amendments. If you like, I can provide you with that.
Yeah. Yes,
Yeah.
please.
Sure.
And one more thing. Do you recall the name of the special rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights that paid the visit? No, there was a visit in August 2017 or not? Yeah, you mentioned a visit by the special rapporteur
Yes.
in August 2017.
No, it wasn't in August 2017. It was
okay.
in 2014. It's the special reporter on
okay.
independence of judges and lawyers, and her name, it's the former reporter, and her name is Gabriele Knaul.
So the
So-
visit was in 2014.
14, exactly. And she voiced quite harsh criticism on the legal, on the entire legal
So
system.
in August 2017, she requested a new visit. Is that right? Because you mentioned the most recent request for a country visit.
Yeah.
I was referring.
Well, as there's so many, yes, I have cited that.
Sorry, I just want to make
No,
sure
it's the
I get it.
SRCT. It's the special reporter on counterterrorism, who's the last special reporter to again request a visit to the
Okay.
UAE.
Okay.
So that's the most recent request by
So-
Finaula. Her name, Fiona. I can provide you with
Please
it.
do, yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
yeah, of course.
So, is there any other question in the audience? I think that then we can close our event. I want to thank once again all our female panelists for their brilliant interventions. Thank you for coming. Thank you for those who listen to our event from the live streaming. And thank you so much to everyone.
Yes, absolutely.